Well, one of the reasons that we wanted to do this evening, at least part of the evening, on Armenian Church frescoes and the theology that's present in them is because nowadays, when you go to Armenia, most Armenian churches appear very austere. They appear to be adorned just by their beautiful architectural symmetries, by the geometric elements, the universal elements of their structure, and the very elegant, technologically advanced preparation of the stones that make them up. And that very austerity, I don't know if this is true in your case, but it was in mine, has come to be considered as a hallmark of the spiritual atmosphere of Armenian churches in general. And it's particularly appealing, I think, to Western Christians, especially those of us who come from a Protestant, not to say Puritan, upbringing. And yet the idea of an unadorned surface on the interior of a church is certainly not native to Armenian Christian aesthetics. The earliest adornment of choice for Armenian church structures seems to have been mosaic, as in this very beautiful example from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, where there used to be an Armenian monastery for women. However, mosaic is not within everybody's reach, and a much cheaper and probably quicker to install adornment was frescoes. And we know something about the fact that frescoes were used very early in Armenian churches, thanks to the writing of a man who was locum tenens Catholicos, in other words, the substitute Catholicos of the church for a certain period, who wrote a definitive defense of images. And he describes churches as being decorated specifically in this way. He says, in addition to the Ascension, one may find represented the Nativity, baptism, Passion, crucifixion, entombment, resurrection. So all of the Passion cycle plus the Nativity, as well as hagiographical stories of the saints or the martyrs, particularly in Armenia, Saint Gregory the Illuminator, Saint Gaiane, Saint Hripsime, and the proto-martyr Stephen. So he suggests strongly that Armenians should adorn their churches with these kinds of frescoes. And it's not surprising that in his time period in the 7th century, there was, in fact, a huge efflorescence of frescoed churches. Unfortunately, well, maybe not so unfortunately, I don't know, it depends on how you look at it. Frescoes on Armenian stonework, the stonework is so very clean that the fresco can be painted on a thinner plaster than would be possible in a brick-built Byzantine structure. So on the one hand, this is great if you're the painter or you're the person having to pay to have your church plastered so that it can be painted. But from the point of view of the life of an Armenian fresco, it's not so very good. Life for an Armenian fresco is not an easy thing. And we've seen several churches in our past lectures that actually are frescoed churches. So we're going to go back and have a look at them and see what has become of their frescoes. What can we tell about the original appearance of these frescoes and what has happened to them? So at one point we went to visit St. Hovannes Church in the village of Mastara. 7th century frescoes. This is a very deceptive structure because from the outside, it looks like it's going to be a square space. But from the inside, it has a vast dome and it has a double tetraconch structure. So it has 8 little apses around the inside of it. And so it almost appears round. And one notices almost immediately that the dome, which you can see here, and most of the rest of the church has at one point been plastered, and you can see remnants of the plaster on the ceiling and on the drum of the dome. So one assumes, since the church was completely plastered, it was also completely frescoed. There's only one glitch in this assumption, and that is that this is not the original plaster from the 7th century, unfortunately. The villagers in Mastara are extremely proud, rightfully so, of their incredible church. And so in the 19th century, wanting the church to look its best, wanting it to be in the most beautiful condition possible, they hired a French carpentry team to install in the west end of the church, as much as you can have an end on a round church, the west side of the church, a gallery, a beautiful balcony in the latest style for the choir, up near, almost near the dome. And you can see the location of it would give the choir a fantastic bird's eye view of the altar. So it's almost like you're up there in the clouds looking down at everything that's going on the altar. So they were very pleased with that. But meanwhile, the frescoes in the church were looking a bit ratty. And so to keep the interior looking spruce, they had the whole church plastered, nice and white. Then, in the 20th century, just after the fall of the Soviet Union, so within some of our living memory, when after 70 years or so, the villagers are finally able to freely use their beloved church again, the first thing they did for it was to clean it, which they did with hose and wire brushes and other similarly sharp implements, doing incredible damage to the delicate carvings over the lintels of their sacristies. So you can see at one point there was a well-outlined 6-winged angel above the doorway. Now you can barely see it. The cross has been severely dinged up. The angel on the other side is in even worse condition. And needless to say, they also did significant damage to the ancient frescoes. So you can tell they're there sometimes. A wonderful pair of restorers from Italy, actually one was an Armenian, one was a Belgian. They were only able, without doing further violence to the church, they were only able to recover just a few fragments from what had once covered the church, including these shadowy, haloed saints. And they have uncovered the bottom parts of other figures that had once been there. Not enough necessarily to tell who they were, just to tell that they were there. Interestingly, the best preserved remnants of frescoes in Mastara are on the staircase to that balcony. I think they may have survived up there because it was just much harder to get something sharp in there to clean the plaster off the wall. So you can see you had a military saint. You can see part of the horse. You can see the cloak billowing out behind him. And so as far as we can tell, the frescoes in this church are not simply telling the biblical story. It looks as though they may have deeper significance. We can see that better at another church that we visited when we looked at small and intimate spaces, another 7th century structure, Substepanos, also known as Lambatavank, near the village of Artik, in what used to be the territory of the Kamsaragan clan, highly placed movers and shakers in the pre-Bagratid world, who really enjoyed playing around with this tiny church style. We saw also their very small chapel constructed in Tallinn, and we're going to return to Tallinn in just a minute. But it wasn't just the size of the church that they really liked to play with. They also have some spectacularly interesting, theologically based frescoes. You can see remnants of plaster again in various places around the church, especially in the apse. So again, you can see the white blotches and the places where thankfully the white has peeled off, beginning to reveal what was underneath. And so it's possible to see in the church frescoes of, again, military saints, so they seem to be quite popular, Saint Sarkis and Saint George. But the real star fresco in this church, theologically speaking, is that one in the apse. And as you come closer to the apse, if you have a telephoto lens or you're up on scaffolding, the general picture in the apse becomes much clearer and, in a way, more puzzling. Fortunately for us, these frescoes were restored again by a pair of experts trained in Italy. The restoration took place in 2013, so visitors nowadays can see them much better than they did the time that I first visited this church. So if we look closely at what's in the apse, we see something that we might predict from other traditions and other churches. You can see that there is a Christ enthroned. He's clearly a Pantocrator Christ, a Christ who rules the universe. But he's sitting on an odd throne. And as we look more closely at the throne, we see that it has wheels. And we see that in between the wheels, there you see two sets of two wheels, in between those are standing winged figures. And we realize that the Christ in this apse is enthroned on the great chariot from the vision of Ezekiel, a vision so important to his prophecy that it was told twice, recounted in the first chapter and then again in the 10th. And Armenians interpreted this vision, this chariot in particular, as an explanation for a representation of the cross. Christ had gone up on the cross as on a chariot, specifically this chariot. This chariot moved and held up by angelic beings. So the learned viewer looking at this would realize that what stands above the altar is at one and the same time Christ crucified and Christ reigning in glory. And then the viewer might also notice that those wheels hang over the border of the fresco into the top of the mid-space of the apse, meaning that they hang out into our space. These are what the viewer is supposed to most take to heart. So if Christ crucified is carried through the universe in triumph by a chariot with wheels and tetramorph beings, one face of each of them is a human face, then perhaps there is something there for us to consider doing in the world, to become thrones of Christ. And of course, these faces are where we derive the symbols of the four evangelists. So that adds another layer of complexity to this depiction. The crucified Christ is borne aloft in omnipresent glory everywhere in the universe on the motive power, on the moving power of the evangelists and their message.
Well, the wheels in that image were
Mm-hmm.
Janine was just making a comment that it reminds her of the cherubims on the Ark of the Covenants.
Yes, it would, except that those ones are reaching out towards each other. These ones seem to be folded up completely. So there's a moment of rest in the movement of the chariot, it appears. And here you can see the four faces of the beings. The human face, the bull face is particularly clear. And it's interesting that we find this depiction elsewhere also in this time period, although we won't be showing you pictures of that this evening because we don't have that much time. But I wanted to move from this depiction to another Kamsaragan construction that we looked at already from the outside, the great 7th century cathedral at Tallinn. It's so very beautiful, pristinely geometric in its other decorative elements. And yet this cathedral also benefited from the Kamsaragan clan's preference for unusual, symbolic, theological, interpretive renderings in the apse. So if we take our attention away from the dome, which is where everyone's eye goes the first thing they come into this church, and we move it to the apse, there's not much that can be seen there now. However, on the white plaster, you can see it's peeled away, so you have a lot of the dark stone showing through, but there's enough of the white plaster with paint on it still remaining that people have been able to get up and have a really close look at this fresco, study it extensively, and I think they had a hard time believing what they saw in their reconstruction. And perhaps you will too. This is what stands in the apse above the altar. Above the altar is an altar. Above the altar is a table. You can see it in the center of the apse fresco. And what's on that table? There's no Jesus here. There's no Pantocrator. There's no Mary with child. There is the written word of God. And so you have Christ represented as the Logos, as the word of God, with flanking the book, not only the celestial bodies that you can see there represented as stars, but also flanked by angels. And so, Janine, if you wanted to think again of the Ark of the Covenant, this would be one way to do it. And so you can look at this and interpret it in many different ways, none of them completely obvious. And so the Kamsaragans really planned to challenge people coming into this building to consider the ramifications of what they were seeing and the importance that they particularly gave to Christ as word. A little bit different way of using frescoes shows up at one of the churches in Ani. It's miraculous that this church has survived. The Church of St. Gregory, also known as the Church of Tigran Honenț for its builder. He was an extravagantly wealthy merchant in the city, or a Baron, as he and his peers called themselves. It's in relatively good shape, considering where it is, and it is impressively frescoed. Even with all the damage that has been done to this church, you can still see that it was a floor-to-ceiling fresco job. And the frescoes address two main themes. First of all, the life of Christ, just painted on the eastern end of the church. And secondly, and I believe lined up with it rather well, 16 scenes from the life of St. Gregory the Illuminator on the western end of the church, including this one, which shows his trial before King Turdat, and this one showing Gregory being hanged upside down as one of the tortures to which he was subjected prior to being placed in the pit. And I don't think that paralleling the life of Christ and the life of St. Gregory is in any way accidental. In other words, at least in the mind of this Armenian builder, the explanation for the life of St. Gregory is to be sought in the life of Christ, but the reverse is also true. The meaning of the life of Christ for Armenians is to be sought as well in the life story of St. Gregory. And lastly, in terms of background, I would like to show you a place at the opposite end of the Armenian world, especially as it is today. In the Debed Gorge, on the way to Georgia, where there are several frescoed churches, one more beautiful than the last, lies the monastery and later the fortress of Ahtala. Ahtala was reconstructed in the 13th century on the foundation of a 10th century church, of a Bagratid church belonging to the Gyurikian clan. And when you walk into this church, the very first thing to strike your eye is the altar apse. You can't miss it. The blue is like startlingly blue. These are the great bishops of the church, including St. Gregory, although he doesn't stand out at all in the lineup. He's there and he's labeled, he's on the right-hand side. And above you have a typical Byzantine motif with Christ giving communion to the disciples. And you can see that Christ is shown double there. One of him is facing left, the other is facing right as he distributes the elements to the disciples ranked in two groups. And so you almost don't notice at first, but when you draw your eye finally away from that apse, you realize that the entire church is frescoed. And as you look around, you notice that there are certain scenes in it that are very dear to Armenians. You may recognize this one, where there are 40 crowns floating above 40 people, or 39. The 40th is going to be climbing out of the lake and going into the bathhouse where it's warm. So the 40 martyrs of Sebastia is one of the many things depicted on this church. The northern wall of the church is dedicated to Jesus's trial before the Sanhedrin. And in the center, his trial before Pilate. And then on the right, you can see him being led away, bound. So if the northern wall is devoted to the Passion, the southern wall, love how the light hits things in this church. The southern wall is devoted to the resurrection. So you have the Passion and its fulfillment. You have the death and the resurrection facing one another. And above the victorious Christ holding a cross in the center is the figure of one of the stylite saints, of whom Armenia had several, as well as, of course, venerating Saint Simeon, the stylite from the Syriac world, who considered his exposed life on top of the pillar to be a sign to people of the death of Christ on the cross. And then when you turn to exit from this church, the murals on the frescoes on the west end, the west wall. So the last thing you see as you're leaving the church, the message that you should be taking with you back into the world, shows not only the Last Judgment, which you can see a little bit of there on the left, but centrality in this depiction is given to Adam and Eve re-entering paradise. And you can see the Virgin Mary enthroned by the tree of life, to which they now have access. And you can see others on the right approaching the door. Oh. Below, at the level of the monks who would be leaving this church, are larger than life depictions of the desert saints who inspired their monastic efforts, who inspired them to aim for their own entry into the kingdom of heaven. And so whether they are aiming to challenge a person theologically, as the Kamsaragans did, whether they are aiming to encourage monastics to remember the value of the sufferings of Christ and to keep in mind the value of their own ascetic labors as a way of regaining paradise, or whether they are designed to show us the connection between the universal events of Christ's life and those of St. Gregory. The Armenian world of frescoes was not just a way to offer people, the illiterate, a view of Scripture. It was much more than that. So having said that by way of introduction, I'd like to turn the screen over to Dr. Shahinian, who will focus in more clearly and closely on the incredible frescoes of the church at Akhtaman.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so apologies for the technical issues today. And as Dr. Ervine said, thankfully this wasn't the experience throughout the term. It is celebrating our last lecture, actually. The technology is excited. So going back to Akhtamar, if you recall a few lectures ago, although the frescoes at Akhtamar are damaged and repainted, as I shared last time, and at first sight, they might not come across as potent as the reliefs we see on the church of Akhtamar on the outside. These frescoes are of primary importance for the history of the Eastern Church decoration and adoration. The church is adorned with frescoes which represent the extensive Christological cycle. Now, the church in Akhtamar serves one of the best examples for this, and the discovery of it, very recent actually, comparably in history, makes this point. And several scholars who have focused on the frescoes in Akhtamar have made fascinating discoveries about this. Now, the most fascinating and recent discovery is the existence of the paintings in the drum of the dome. You can somewhat see it in this slide. Now, floral and geometric designs, birds, cover the the conchs of the niches, which alternate between the windows. Figure representations fill up the upper half of the drum and occasionally extend into the spaces between the niches and the windows. Unfortunately, more than a third of this decoration has disappeared. But it is evident from what remains that the story of Adam and Eve was originally painted all around the drum. Now, inserting a note, yes, very unique. And I would insert a note going back to what I said in lecture 8, that everything outside is Old Testament, everything inside is New Testament, but here goes it's the architecture, it's a theology of the architecture to represent the Garden of Eden in this new light. So this is very interesting, I think. So the central dome represents the heavens. The artist depicts here the terrestrial paradise, which most of it, again, is lost, in which the human beings were placed, and this was the last, and until their expulsion. The scene from the life of Christ, painted on the walls of the church, we call the lost paradise, which instills hope that it will be regained through the incarnation and the sacrifice of Christ. So that's the intermarrying of all the various levels, which I will show in a moment in a diagram. Church fathers paint the picture that while the first paradise was lost through the fruit of a tree and the deception of a Satan, we enter into this new paradise with Christ, where we have the cross of life, a different tree and a different fruit, planted by the same planter, and this tree has taken root and has blossomed through his life-giving blood, and it dispels the deception and illuminates the truth of life. One second. There we go. Okay, the frescoes, which cover the interior walls of the church, create a dialogue both in theology and style with the external sculptural figures, the ones that we see outside of the church, the reliefs. If we are to look at the sculptural figure on the outside of the church and corresponded with the frescoes inside the church, we could see first that these artistic styles come from the same artistic school, but also the relationality to how the architect arranged them to create a stylistic affinities. For instance, a bishop relief compared with a portrait of the east facade, we can observe the figures shown in bold outlines, the same manner of stylization in the delineation of the draperies, the same facial types with a low, broad forehead and a large almond-shaped eyes. The same treatment of the mustache or beard, which encircles as if it was covering their entire mouth. So if we look at those comparisons, the left one is the relief of, this is Bishop Saint Nisibis, and then on the right we can see the actual fresco painting, which then, if you were to bring them over, you could see some of these very much artistic styles matching both physically, as they are both on the east facade of the church, one from the inside, one from the outside.
Do we have any idea who that internal bishop is?
I think we do. I do not recall it off the top of my head, but yes, we do know who it is. It's Ilka. I will look it up and perhaps during question and answer return to it if that's okay. But I do have it somewhere in my notes. Mm-hmm. Now, as promised, in terms of the diagram, the three levels we see here match the three bands wrapped around the entire Holy Cross Church from the outside, decorated with all kinds of floral, fruits, and decorative designs. If you remember going back a few weeks, I talked about the bands that wrapped around, the three different bands that wrapped around all over the Ahtamar Church. This we can see from the internal now. And what's interesting is how each layer, we have three different bands, how they correspond from the inside and the outside. So the Christological cycle begins with the upper section. You see the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, the upper section from south to north above the royal gallery, which with depictions of the Annunciation, the Visitation, and the Nativity. So if the dome area was, if we recall just a second ago, it's the paradise, then after the dome, we come into this first band, which is the Annunciation, Visitation, and Nativity stories from the Gospels. I will give an example of this in just a minute. The second register, minus the King's Gallery, if you could see where it says King's Gallery right here, it's decorated with figural scenes painted in imitations of hanging fabrics, so some signs of representing royalty, decorated with jeweled borders. Now, the third tier and the lowest cycle, below the gallery where the king sits, ends with the depiction of the second coming of Christ. And again, not in very good condition, but this is what we can see from what has remained. If we now imagine everything I just shared is looking at from the south facade of the church inside towards the north, and if we can just imagine the king sitting where his sort of balcony is, the scene that he is reminded of and intentionally it's positioned directly before him on the north facade is directly opposite to the gallery, the royal gallery, is the crucifixion of Christ and the tomb where he was placed. And a little bit to the right, we do have the resurrection. So it's one of the less, better preserved, I should say, frescoes. We can actually make out the various lines and some of the colors, and be able to sort of discern a little bit of the scene compared to some of the other ones I was just showing earlier. Much more difficult to understand the scene, although it has been thoroughly studied by a few scholars, which then we are able to recreate some of that. So Lynn Jones and C.R.P. de Nersessian, two scholars who have written probably the most about this, and a few others also. Lalayan, Yervant Lalayan has also written a little bit about this, just some scholars I've been engaging with as I've been preparing the various interpretations of these frescoes. She writes, Lynn Jones writes about her observations and asserts that the unusual orientation of the cycle is attributed to the presence of the royal gallery. The scenes are arranged so that the king was effectively bracketed by them, enclosed with a narrative cycle that begins above his head and it ends below his feet. The orientation and the pointed backdrops of the gallery were the focused attention on the king, which then suggests that King Gagik I, when he was present during the liturgy, he was incorporated into the decorative program. Oh, again, implications of the artist. But no, not only as a decorative program, but this is the earthly king who has wrapped all around himself, architecturally, the Christological cycle. So he enters into that. Few more points. The angel, and I'm going back a bit to the second band, so the first band after the dome, the angel of the Annunciation, with one wing sharply bent back in a horizontal line above his head, closely resembles the angel standing next to Christ on the south facade. And the throne of the Virgin is almost identical with the throne carved on the same facade. So we see here in the image is Christ on the throne, on the relief, the sculptural relief on the south facade outside, and immediately on the south facade is Mary, and the throne is also very much representative, or sort of a mirroring image. The Annunciation of the south etc. is the first zone. In the first zone shows that the angels advancing from the left, Mary with arms raised in a seated full-faced on an ornate throne, which has high back, slightly curved at the very top. And if you can see this screen, I'm just pointing it out right here. Oh no, maybe I should do it right here. Okay, right here. The visitation to the right of it, so if you go more right here, we see Mary and Elizabeth clasp one another in a close embrace. Their faces are turned towards the spectator, if we notice here. In the nativity fresco scene, Mary and Joseph are seated on either side of the manger, which is a high masonry structure placed under the arched opening of the cave. The infant Jesus lies on top of the manger, and the head of the ox and the ass can be seen behind it. The details of the fresco is yet a lot more. The two shepherds wearing their short clocks, close-fitted trousers, and these details I'm pointing out because even in the ruins that it is, we can still be able to sort of tell the interliners of these. Stand behind Mary. This is the shepherds, and the sheep lie right on the ground. The magi, identified by the inscription, stand in a corresponding position right behind Joseph. Now, one of the better preserved frescoes is the raising of Lazarus and Christ's entry into Jerusalem. Christ standing on the right spears to be addressing a group on the left. Christ followed by the apostles, aligned in 3 rows, one above another, stand next to the sepulcher, which is merely suggested by a rectangle band drawn around the figure of Lazarus. Mary and Martha stand behind the sepulcher. Their names are also inscribed next to them. Right, let me see if I can show that right here, the inscription. Entry to Jerusalem, Christ is seated front view on a donkey, approaches from the left, followed by the apostles, and that's this one right here.
Where are his eyes looking? Is he looking ahead or is he looking at the viewer? Can you tell?
It's not clear to me.
He's looking up. Oh, that's interesting.
But what about on the left side, next to Lazarus, as he's walking in? At us.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
That's interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, good point. Mm-hmm. That's a good observation. Very good. So coming back to sort of a more of a gallery view of some of the frescoes, just to go through a couple more, then I'll close this part of the reflective lecture, I would say. And then I think this one too. Really what it stood out to me in that preparation was not only what it contributes to how we understand Eastern Christian churches as early as the 9th, 10th century, but it also comments that, you know, not going with the assumption that images were not part of the church. Here, Ahtamar becomes an example that as early than the 9th century, we have the church completely decorated in this way. And it is one of, and according to the scholars researching the various comparative frescoes, it's one of the best representatives of Armenian style frescoes, as opposed to what we may see in the Byzantium or in other traditions.
And it's interesting that, as you pointed out, it seems to be made at least in part, designed at least in part, for a specific viewer, for the king to see it in a different way than the people who are worshiping in the space below.
That's right. All the bands have a very particular positioning for the beholder, that being the king.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has a certain angle to the altar as well. And all of that positioning all fits together as, again, this artistic, grandiose sort of coming together. Both
Possibly a reminder to him too of who he should be.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, since he's sitting there surrounded by the nativity and above the Last Judgment, I would think that would make me feel somewhat cautioned, shall we say, about how I wanted to live my life.
Especially when his immediate view is that the view of the crucifixion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's a humbling place to be, that the king of the universe was crucified.
Mm-hmm.
You, as the king of Vaspuragan, where is your position?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in their history, having the various traditions of the martyrs, I think Gagik is very aware of the idea of a sacrificial life. So whether that represents him or not, it definitely comes through in some of the efforts he puts out there, whether it's his ancestral history, or here in this case, we see in the crucifixion.
You know, and the fact that there are two of his martyred relatives on the outside facade of the church.
Sahak and Hamazes, 8th, 9th century martyrs, positioned immediately outside of the, I believe, in the east facade, looking eastward.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think I have one question here about the date. And the date. The interesting thing about the frescoes is they date right from the time when Ahtamar was built. So that's 915. Within 7 years, this whole project was completed. 5 to 7 years. It was a magnificent effort, and this was.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and the frescoes are from that time period. And I will close my part on the frescoes.
Yes, we'll give you a 5-minute break while we set up for the second half of this evening. We're going to be moving from the antique world to the compromises that have to be made in the modern world in order to maintain Armenian worship spaces. With some of these, I'm sure you will be very familiar, and with others, we will just have them as food for thought going forward into life beyond this class.
Yes, and it would be very nice to have your contributions as we're talking about these churches, and some of them could even be your parish.
It's
So,
possible.
yes, so we'll look forward to that. So 5 minutes and we'll be right back. We are perfect. We are back for the second half of today's lecture, and Dr. Ervine will start with the Armenian churches in the diaspora.
Yeah. So when we look around Armenian communities, I think one of the first things an Armenian does is to go see where the church is. And we find churches in the diaspora that indicate to us that people in these communities have not looked simply to recreate worship spaces from Armenia, and there can be many reasons for that. Depending on where you are, you may have difficulties with the technology. There may be other types of resources that are missing. There may be other local issues. There may be the hope not to stand out so much in the landscape. And there's a lot of variety in this. Armenians began spreading out beyond the confines of their mountainous home plateau very early, integrating themselves into multiple other cultural and linguistic spheres. And in each location where they settled, Armenians maintained their traditional forms of worship to the degree that they could, but more often than not, the traditional structures within which that worship had traditionally taken place weren't available. So I would like us to look at a few of the very many buildings that Armenians in far-flung places have used for worship. So before Dr. Shahinian talks to us about the vast variety of structures that there is simply within the American diaspora, I would like us to have an idea of how wide that variety is, how diverse the options are that Armenians have chosen over time in order to make traditional Armenian worship possible for their communities. So in this picture, you see a church that if you were to look at it from the other side, from the side that doesn't have the little cumpet things on it, you would look at that and you would think that you were looking at a mosque. This is the Church of St. Mary in Isfahan. And I could have brought any one of several other Isfahani churches, all of them looking exactly like a mosque on the outside, and on the inside, some of them look more Armenian than others. Some of them look a little bit more Renaissance European. It depends on where you are. And yet, when you stay for a service in any one of these spaces, it's very recognizably Armenian. So this architecture blends in. This architecture takes its cues from the surrounding culture, adopts the things in that culture that it finds beautiful, and then labels the structure as Armenian by adding an Armenian element to it. Some of you will certainly realize that this city is Beirut. Beirut has numerous churches in it. I'd like to just look at this one. This is Surp Nishan in Beirut. And if you look at it, you go, aha, yeah, that's an Armenian church. It has that central dome. It has blind arcades that you would find in Ani, except that they all have windows. And yet there's something about it. You would be very surprised to find this church in Armenia. But to find it in the diaspora, it kind of makes sense. You have elements on it that are not exactly traditionally Armenian. You have building materials that are not traditionally Armenian. And yet, if you were to view this from the top, I'm sure you would see the cruciform structure of it. It's a bit more basilical, a bit more longer on the ends than you might expect, but still it's quite recognizable. Then there's this church. Some of you may recognize this. The church is not visible whatsoever from the street. In fact, the church is nearly not visible from its own front door. This is the Cathedral of St. James in Jerusalem. And the structure itself, while it used to be perfectly central to the monastic complex, has been surrounded by other things within that had to be built within the limited space that was allotted for this monastic complex. So the door, you can see the gate that leads you to the door, but there's nothing that marks this facade as being obviously a church until you get inside. And then when you look at it, if it weren't for the dome over the middle, you might wonder, is this an Armenian church? Is this not an Armenian church? So here too, there's limitations on the space possibilities for what can be used to create the church. And so certain compromises have had to be made with the surrounding quarter of the city. This is also a church that lives on the donations of pilgrims, the gifts of pilgrims. And so the tiles are gifts of pilgrims. The lamps are gifts of pilgrims. And at that point, you're not creating a central decorative theme. You're taking what people bring to you. So it's an interesting combination of things. This used to be a frescoed church. The frescoes are still there, but they were in very bad condition. And at a time when the authorities did not have the money or the personnel to restore them, they simply replaced them with oil paintings. The oil paintings stand above, they stick out from the wall. Underneath them are the original frescoes. So at some point, if someone has the time and the money and the personnel to do it, they could be fully restored. What about the Armenian community in Baghdad? Baghdad is a different world. And yet, its church, the Cathedral of St. Gregory, we're going to see a lot of St. Gregory's in the diaspora, whereas all traditional Armenian churches in the homeland were named for the Holy Mother of God. The ones in the diaspora are very often named for St. Gregory. And we can think of, we at the seminary can think of an example just a few miles down the road. So if you look at this from the outside, what is it that the builders have chosen to focus on as the Armenian element? And does this resemble any other church that you know of?
Etchmiadzin?
It looks like Etchmiadzin. Yes, it does. And you have the two Armenian domes on the top of it, and this nostalgic reminder of the church in the homeland. However, when you go into the church, again, you would have to wonder, is this an Armenian church? Is this not an Armenian church? It's adopted for convenience the habits of other traditions that provide fixed seating and chandeliers and things of that kind. Staying in the Middle East, this is Damascus. And the Armenian church in Damascus, St. Sarkis, is again a kind of a compromise structure. It has a kumpet, clearly, and the kumpet has the semi-rounded, almost mosque-like dome on it. And if it weren't for the crosses, you might wonder. The church blends in rather well with its neighborhood. It doesn't disappear into the neighborhood like St. James does, but still, it fits in. This is a nostalgic photo, since there's been much damage to this city in recent months. This is Aleppo. And its church of the Holy Mother of God. How would you know this church is Armenian? It has kind of Mamluk style marble patterns around the door. The church itself, you would have to wonder if it weren't for the Khachkar. You would have to wonder what exactly this building was. And at some time, I believe you can ask, those of you who know him can ask Deacon Ervine for some interesting information about the building of this church. So another option, a blending in option. A not 100% obvious functionality. And then if we go to a completely different part of the globe, we have another St. Gregory Church. This is the St. Gregory Church in Singapore. You can see this poor little church is surrounded by Malaysian high-rise buildings. And if you were to look at it from the outside, I don't know about you, but I personally might think that this was a very sophisticated country club. And when you go into the sanctuary also, you can see that there are needs that you have for ventilation and such when you live in a climate like that of Singapore. So again, if it were not for the curtain and the painting over the altar, you might wonder exactly what type of church you had wandered into. But once again, when the service begins, you know where you are. A different way of fitting into the neighborhood. This is the Church of Holy Nazareth in Calcutta. If you look at this building, your first thought would not be probably, oh, an Armenian church. Possibly looking at that thing that might be a kumpet on the top. It could cross your mind, I wonder if. But the whole way that this building is structured says nothing about anything Armenian, and yet it is. How about this one? This is the Church of the Holy Resurrection. This is so Paruchian. In Dhaka, Bangladesh. There is no way that if you weren't told, you would know from anything structural about this building that it was an Armenian church. I would love to know the history of why this building was chosen and how it developed. It stands out in its own neighborhood, not for its Armenianness, but for its, I don't know, what do we call that? Its elegant, non-Armenian design. So clearly different parts of the world take advantage of different building options. And not all of them feel that it's necessary or possible, perhaps, to Armenize the building, at least externally. There's a great deal of variety in the solutions chosen for worship spaces. The same kind of variety pertains when we move to Europe and we begin to find many reused buildings there as well. So for those of you who are familiar with it, this is the Mochitarist Center on the island of San Lazzaro off of Venice. It was given to the Mochitarists as a full complex, the way that it was. And as you can see, there's not a lot of Armenization that has happened to these structures. Instead, they've been renovated and kept as they are, with the exception of the basilica in the background. And that has not been very Armenized either. And yet everyone knows that despite the European quality of the architecture, as soon as you walk into the library of this area, you know where you are. You may not quite know where you are in the liturgical services because their music is very different from what people are used to in the West or in Etchmiadzi, and they have their own way of doing music. It's very beautiful, it's just very different. Staying in Italy, the city of Livorno also has a St. Gregory church. And if you didn't know what it was, you might think that it was the facade of a very upscale store, or perhaps some kind of a luxury hotel. It is not. This is the Armenian church in the city. There is nothing about the exterior of this church which would tip you off in any way. Much less here. It took me forever to find this church because I was not expecting it to look like this. This is the Church of the Holy Spirit in Amsterdam. It's the white building on the left. Yeah, it's not the blue house with the balconies. It's the white building on the left. The community purchased it because it was large enough for their needs. And since it is in the center of, well, actually it's off to the edge now of Amsterdam with all of its canals and little streets, it's going to be local architecture completely. Until you see over the door the inscription. There is also nothing in the interior of this building that would label it an Armenian church in any possible way. And one has to wonder what the long-term effect is on successive generations of Armenians who worship in a space like this, a space that, thank God, exists, but a space that does not carry any of the characteristics of traditional Armenian churches. Instead, you could find, a Dutch Reformed congregation would be equally at home in this space. And then there are the exceptions. St. Sarkis, London, was built by the Gulbenkians just to put it in London. It's like they took the bell tower at Halbat, reconstructed it, put it down in London. And there it is when you come, it's indescribable the way you feel the first time you come upon this thing if you're not expecting it. And I'm sure every Armenian who goes by it feels the same thing. It's that, oh, I know what that is. That at home feeling. A feeling that you do not get if you visit the Armenian Church of the Holy Trinity in Manchester, where Diran Nersoyan served for some years as pastor. It's just a Church of England church redone.
And it's the oldest one.
Mm-hmm. So the community did not have the possibility of building a purpose-built Armenian church. And you can kind of tell the age of some of the churches, the age of the communities, by whether they were able to build an Armenized church or not. The earlier communities, no. The later communities, many of them, yes. Different solutions. If you go to Cyprus and you can get into Famagusta, you will find this Armenian church there. This is the Holy Mother of God, Famagusta. It's not an operative church anymore. I believe it's going to be turned into a cultural center, but at least it was restored. It's a perfectly fine Crusader church. There's nothing Armenian about it. If you go to Crete, the same thing pertains there. This church, you can see there's a cumpet on it. There's a kind of a small, maybe it's a bell tower type thing on the front of it. But you would have to wonder until you come to the entrance and you go over the door where you have something for everybody, linguistically speaking. You have the Greek on the top, and then below it, you have half English and half Armenian. The Armenian Church of Hovanugarabed. Mm-hmm. So Hovanes has made it into the genitive case, accounting for the of. And there it is. And there are, of course, many other churches in the islands and on Greece proper. But I'd like to move along here to something this is on my bucket list. I would love to see this place. This is the Armenian monastery at Suceava in Romania. This is still a functioning monastery, I believe. And there's talk about restoring it as a community. I believe the saint to whom their church is dedicated is Saint Auxentius. Again, not an Armenian saint normally. So there's a blending, not only of architecture, but also of local saints, types of worship. And also in the Eastern European world, we have this. This is the Cathedral of St. Mary in Lviv, Ukraine. So as you can see, and if you look at it from the other side, it actually looks a good bit different. This is its courtyard. You can see the main entrance there into the courtyard. It has a cumpet. It's now, I believe, a Roman Catholic Armenian church. Everything in that area was converted to Roman Catholicism. And yet the church maintains something of its identity. Down the road, quite a ways. We have St. George Plovdiv, Bulgaria. Looking at this church from the outside, you would think Byzantine immediately. It's a basilica church. It's a very sweet basilica church. Has a little tiny compet on the top. What you see to the foreground of the screen is the museum of the church. They have a fantastic collection of liturgical objects that were brought by different people fleeing to Bulgaria from parts of Anatolia. And then in the background, you see the school. They have a K-12 school. It all fits inside one courtyard, kind of a full service community center. So in Eastern Europe, you have things that look Eastern European. When you move to St. Gregory, Buenos Aires, however, it's a whole different story. You would never mistake this church for something in Eastern Europe. It's Armenian. You have two compets on the top. This is very good, but the whole understory holding it up is something else. And to round out our little tour in South America, I wanted to put these two on the screen. They're both Armenized, but in different ways. On the left, you see the Nersesnorali Church in Montevideo, in Uruguay. And on the right, you see Subkevork, São Paulo, in Brazil. If you look at the Montevideo church, you think, that looks like a lot of churches in the US, actually. It's kind of a Protestant structure with a porch put on it that looks something like a Jamadun. And then you have a nice compet over the middle. Whereas in Sao Paulo, what you have is a much more Roman-looking church. Very long basilical church, very large windows and so on. And then the compets on it. So the variety of solutions that Armenians have found, solutions compromises with reality, compromises with resources, compromises with local culture. The variety is so great that it makes this structure plausible. If you've been looking at Armenian churches around the world and you suddenly come across this, you go, wow, that's so creative. And it will bear a label that says the Armenian Church in Osaka. And you go, man, those Japanese Armenians must be something. And then you realize that that is a computer-generated fantasy image of what an Armenian church in Osaka might look like. But there's so much variety anyway. Why not? Perfectly plausible. So having looked at this very quick glance through just a few of the hundreds of Armenian churches that there are in the diaspora, we're going to dial it back to the US. We're going to stay in the US. And Dr. Shahinian is going to show us some of what solutions have been brought about here. Some of you may recognize places that you know.
Yes. Okay. So, let's see here. I think it just does the perfect. All right. For time's sake, I'm just going to go. What I would like to do briefly is to go back to where we started from the first lecture, speaking about space. Keeping this local adaptation in the back of our minds, just not to forget what Dr. Ervine achieved in her lecture. I think that was very interesting. I will be returning to some of those points. I want to take us back to the first opening lecture on space, time, place. These big questions I raised about what is space, and if space matters, why? Why do we care? How important is space to our psychology and spiritual experiences of ourselves, God, and others, and the activities which we engage in these enclosed spaces? We build structures, buildings, and we enclose space for interaction, creating space for gatherings, and building communities. How do we live well in the midst of that created order? Places shape us. They contribute to our conception of the way things are in the world, and they constitute the terrain upon which our lives unfold. If empty space can be disclosed in form and function through architectural structures, what could be said of the questions where and when these structures are erected, and how and why they are consecrated and constructed the way that they are versus other styles? We looked at various aspects of how Armenians create space through church structures in the particular and nuanced architectural designs, which is informed by their environment, historical circumstances, political conditions. And one of these points was something like the tuf and the natural resources in Armenia that were used for churches, and how that shaped the strength, the color, and the styles of churches, just to highlight one. Now, all of the history that Dr. Ervine and I have shared becomes important context and a way to contrast to what we observe when we look at churches, Armenian churches in the diaspora. It is interesting to observe what the community and the architects together valued and prioritized in building their structures. First, I'm going to show a few churches that aimed closely to represent the Armenian architecture. But what we can say is that, and perhaps the questions we can ask as we look at them, is some of the structures of the Armenian architectural designs we looked at are these cruciform churches, which was very important discovery in Armenian architecture. What is the dome and the gavit, or the geometric numberings of the 8, 10, 16 in these designs? It is not my aim to provide a historical survey of the churches and their sort of details, but I am particularly interested in highlighting some of them for observation. I would like to look at the form of the church and what they may seem to remind us of, especially looking at it within the historical structure or the environment that it's in. Perhaps the question to keep in mind is asking what are some of the continuities and some of the discontinuities to the structures that we have been observing thus far throughout the last 10 weeks. But also, what are and what were the practical considerations in purchasing lands, buildings, or what were the previous church's limitations to what could be done for the purposes of repurposing to make it a place of Armenian worship? What seems to emerge as I reflect on these churches, and I'll give you a little bit of a summation here, is that in the diaspora, what was that while we have focused on defining space more architecturally throughout our lectures, architectural, philosophical definitions, what becomes clear here is that the cultural landscape, geographic location, and the socioeconomic contexts are also to be considered when we think about how we understand church as space. So with that, the first one I would like to bring to our attention is a church I recently visited. So there is no really logical order to this other than my aim is to present churches, perhaps the ones I've been to, or also the ones that, with the help of Dr. Ervine, identifying where they really did aim to maintain the structural Armenian church structure. And of course, we can have a discussion whether that really is happening or not. So here's one of the oldest Armenian churches in America. It was built in 1927, 1971, you're right. So 1927 is when the search committee came together and they bought this land where on it was a Methodist church. Is that right?
So this is the third church.
Okay.
For this parish, and that was the second parish.
Okay.
Kind of, it had taken a Methodist church and then harmonized it a little bit.
And then it was reconstructed.
And that was a different location.
Oh, it was a completely different location.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is the challenge
Well,
of,
that's very interesting
Yeah.
and complex.
Yes, this is the third location,
St.
This is-
Peter has been there a while.
So-
1899.
Oh, my gosh. I had no idea it was
1899
that.
in this
Just looking
location.
At that church.
The parish was formed in 1899. They've been in this location since 1971, I believe.
Yes, under Torgom Manukyan, Archbishop Torgom Manukyan. Yes. Interesting. So originally the Methodist Church is no longer one that we're looking at. That was reconstructed. That was a different place, different location. This is great. So again, if this is a parish church you've been to, or it's your parish, do correct me as I'm going through this. This is very helpful.
This is one of the desiderata for scholarship on Armenian life in America is actual histories of some of these churches, because there's very little information available and none of it's in a centralized location that I've been able to find. So
Yes, and it's interesting that you're saying this because online it represents the fact that this was a refurbished Methodist church. So that's a very helpful addition. So what we see here with the St. Peter's Armenian Church built for the third time for the community in 1971 aims to, if we may say, model, what church does this make us think of?
I think.
I think
Ripsime,
closest to
yeah.
Ripsime. It is aiming or going for that. And again, I don't have a different angle to the church, but I also wonder if we could say it's perhaps trying to imitate the cruciform with the diagonal and also the dome. So though all of those efforts are there. So again, one of the oldest parishes, not the oldest, but one of the oldest parishes in America. The next one I like to show is St. Stephanos Armenian Church in Long Branch, New Jersey, a newer construction, actually under the Hovnanians, Kevork Hovnanian. Now, the architecture of St. Stephanos bears much of the characteristics of an ancient Armenian church, or aims to bear much of the characteristics of the Armenian Church, acknowledged to be a brilliant contribution to world history. This is a description right from the website. It is architect Hovsepian, Ramon Hovsepian from Worcester, Massachusetts, who has used the brown man-made stone that resembles tuff and a volcanic rock indigenous to Armenia. The trim on the exterior of the building is copper. A slate roof covers the entire church with the exception of the dome. The intricately folded pyramid-shaped dome rests on 12 sides, drum-shaped structures of the nave. The number 12 is symbolizing the 12 apostles. So interesting again in terms of the numbering. Made of gold, anodized aluminum, it reaches 65 feet into the air.
it's a landmark in Long Branch.
Yes.
You can see it from everywhere.
And just to also briefly, and again, if we look at it, it does give that resemblance. Again, we can have the discussion about which Armenian church. It goes towards Saint Ripsime again, especially in the front where we have those defining columns, which are characteristic also of what we will see later on the Eastern Cathedral, the Eastern Diocese Cathedral. So briefly, a few words on the interior of the church, with the arched ceilings, with smaller arched ceilings at the entry of the doorway. The entire east wall is made of marble. A stained glass mural fills the arch frame between the nave entrance and the narthex, and its depiction of Saint Stephanos, the Nachavaga, so the proto-martyr. The nave has 65-foot high ceilings, as we talked about the dome from the outside, with a plated ceiling rising from a level of 28 feet above the floor and reaching to the peak. The exterior wall of the nave has 6 arched stained glass windows of 1 inch thick. And it's sandplaster made by and then various details local materials like the Heimer stained glass studios. I thought that was interesting because it just then goes into some of the local materials or some of the more native, if I may put it that way. The inscription on the altar reads Siretsek Asmimianis. Yes, sorry, yes, Siretsek Asmimianis zi astvat sire So love one another because God is love. The altar painting is by a gentleman by the name of Gregory Gevorkian, and it depicts the Mother of God and Child Jesus. The wall painting in the apse back of the altar is by Nicholas, I think Hollydick. It depicts the coronation of the Virgin after painting of the same name, attributed to, again, the Hovnanians. Again, if we look at it, very different setup here that we see from, especially the ones we were looking at in the other parts of the Diasporan world. The next church, built in 2005, is St. Sarkis Armenian Apostolic Church of Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, it's standing on a main street in Charlotte, and it's, again, the aim of it is the traditional Armenian church architecture, which it was the wish of the local parish to help educate and inform their neighbors about the Armenian people and the Armenian faith. So it's interesting that how each, again, going back to an original point from my brief introduction, what is it that the parish, the church, or the architect prioritized in the reasons why they did what they did for this location? And in terms of what it resembles, I'm not sure. It is an Armenian church architecture aimed to be an Armenian, but especially the fact that it is wide, that sort of, especially with the, if you want to say the entryway, and this section here, if I can put it pointed, this right here, and then the different level above it, and also how the sides come together. So again, I'm open to hear from the audience what you have envision or kind of what pops out to your imagination during question discussion in just a very brief moment. I'm going to go through these quickly. The other one, again, with the aim of trying to keep within Armenian architecture, is the St. Gregory the Enlightener Church in White Plains, New York. Again, has a very similar entry point with the, sort of semi-coveys, yeah. Another one, briefly, just so that we can be on time, is the St. John's Armenian Church in Detroit. Now, several architects got together for this. I will not go into the names and details, but the aspiration, again, the interest of the architect and the people was the inspiration of to inspire the Armenian community to be and to represent their Christian faith to where they stand in Detroit. The final plans represented many years of these various discussions between the various architects, which I thought was very, very interesting in how they came about. It brought together the wealth of the experience of also from the Armenian community to contribute to, and how the website, the church's website likes to sort of close off the description to say the people of Greater Detroit, giving something to the people of the Greater Detroit area that is something lasting in value. So I thought that's interesting. So not to get into much details here also, but highlighting some of the details of the dome. Again, the golden dome with the enumerated windows, the tower or the entryway, and so on and so forth. This is, it almost, in a way, once I want to say, Zavart notes is something that comes to mind from the top, not the bottom.
Yeah, from the top.
From
It's
the top.
Very wide dome.
very white dome.
And it's that folded dome. You see it in Armenian churches like Mukni.
Mm,
You see it. It's not common, but you have a few of them. So I wonder which one they were looking at for inspiration. Maybe Dirk Arabed.
yeah.
The next time we
The ne-
talk to him, we can ask.
Unfortunately, not easy to find online. So the architects are named and described, but the which church in Armenia that they were actually looking to, probably multiple,
Yeah.
sort of
possibly.
bringing it together. Now going to the West Coast, we have this church in Scottsdale, Arizona. Again, it was interesting again how it all comes together and what's prioritized and how it's built and where it's built. It was a donated land. And the church is named Saint Apkar, who was chosen in the honor of the Hosepian family's father, who was also the donor of the church, to build the church in the 1990s. I think the church was completed sometime in the spring of 2009. So here again, I look at it, it's has all the various characteristics. It aims for the Armenian architectural design, the dome, the gavit, the sort of the tower, and also perhaps even the cruciforms, if we can say. It's aiming for that structure. Now, churches that don't necessarily represent very closely. Here's the Worcester, Massachusetts church, the oldest Armenian community.
This is its current building. It
This is
had a much older building that was not harmonized in any way, shape, or form.
That's right. So this one was consecrated in 1952. But if we look at what Dr. Ervine was just mentioning, this was what the original church. It almost just looks like a Worcester style house, where Armenians gathered for worship back in 1891. That was the first opening of the church doors. Now that doesn't look very Armenian. I thought, at least. I'm open for.
No.
So St.
Would
Paul's
say no.
Armenian Apostolic Church in Syracuse, New York. It's interesting just to really look at the material used. Just essentially, it's an older local church bought and adapted for Armenian use, Armenian church use, and the inside of it. And then one more. This might look familiar to some of us, perhaps.
St. James.
That's right, St. James, Watertown. Built in 1933, consecrated in 37. To me, the first time I saw this church and actually was there, it made me think of England. Very sort of English style, and also the material too, the brick kind of walls.
And that inside ceiling is like you would find in an Episcopal church.
That's right, especially with the wooden, how it holds the ceiling together, sort of the framing, the trusses, yeah. So that's again interesting to compare and sort of have it in comparison to what the churches that were aiming to look resembling Armenian architecture. Actually, I did have one more, and this is going back to California, Van Nuys. It's a very active Armenian community, and it's interesting to see this represented very differently than many of the churches, especially in California, that aim to look more architecturally Armenian. And before I open for question and answer, I thought it's important to just bring to our discussion the Ejmiadzin of the Western Diocese. So the Western Diocese of the Armenian Church, St. Leon, if you could see it with the multiple different towers and whatnot, immediately makes me think of or resembles the Ejmiadzin, but it's much bigger and wider and not as tall. and the Shahinian development were responsible for this building. And to
It
also,
certainly is a statement.
right,
Can't you see this thing from the freeway?
yes, if you're driving right up the 5th freeway in Burbank, Glendale,
You can see it from a distance, then you can see it, and then
Yep.
you can see it in your rear view mirror. There's no question
there
about
is
this.
no, and also actually the history of the building of this church is very interesting because they did not compromise by using local materials. They had tons, and I don't want to know how many thousands, if not millions of tons of tuf transported from Armenia. So this is actual tuf that's been used to build the church in the second Armenia of the world, Glendale, California. Well, this is in Burbank. And then this is the inside that has a very interesting, and perhaps now that I look at it, somewhat similar to what St. Sarkis, the new church in Dallas, has with this big white space, right? So that was something that was I was reflecting on. Ayogaro.
This is a very early picture, almost all the frescoes and none of the frescoes.
That's right. None of the frescoes are on there. That's right.
Mhm.
So now it's full covered with frescoes all over. And do you know when the frescoes were done? I want to say roughly 4 or 5 years ago. It was maybe more, 10 years? I don't remember. Possibly 10 years. Okay.
You remember it looking like this?
I
from the
remember,
fresco?
I've seen it like this. Yeah. Well, not recently, of course, but yes. But I think this is very interesting. And it immediately made me think of St. Sarkis in Dallas.
Yeah, which I don't think has any plans to fresco itself.
And then looking at briefly, very quickly, the Eastern diocese, which we've looked at multiple times, the cathedral Saint Vartan, resembling the Hripsime, Saint Hripsime structure. And then the inside. Oops, there we go.
Now preparing for renovation.
And right now, the cathedral is in the middle of some major renovations. We shall see. And to close off with this image of Saint Hripsime, to say, okay, this is where the aim has been for many of the sort of resemblance and depiction of the American churches that have tried to stay within the Armenian church architecture. With that, I will close my thoughts here and look open for question and answer. And we're just a few minutes over, but
we're hoping that what people will take away from this is encouragement to think, what do we want churches in the American Armenian diaspora to express going forward? Is there the same need for publicity and education for the surrounding community? Is the aim to provide a more homey traditional atmosphere for people who may not have seen the homeland, at least not of late? What is it that Armenians want to achieve in the American scene with their structures?